Okay. World War I, very simple. We've got the two sides. Remember, the actual cause is this sort of assassination of some guy down there in Austria, right? So, okay, so yes, Franz Joseph, the emperor, has been in charge since 1848. He's old, and Franz Ferdinand is going to take over soon. So he's the Archduke. He gets assassinated, right? The clear heir to the throne. So there is, that's a big deal. But why is Russia involved? Why are all these other countries involved? Well, we've got all sorts of factors, right? Russia supports Serbia because of their ethnic connection. That goes back to that nationalism idea. And of course, Russia's allied with France and England because of that fear of Germany and the goal of creating a balance of power. Germany, of course, pisses people off by building in the Navy, right? The construction of its Navy threatens Britain.
Is that William II?
Yes,
Okay.
Kaiser William II, or often it's anglicized to William, Wilhelm in German. So, yes, and so we've got all sorts of factors that lead to what is a war that, when you think about it, doesn't make sense. Why do these European countries wage total war? Willing to kill so many of their young generation in order to, what is the issue? Defend some Serbian guy against some Austrian, So it becomes a war started by this little flame down here in the Balkans, but it ultimately becomes about the balance of power. Who is going to prevail? Will Germany be dominant? Will France and England be dominant? And that's a big question. And neither side is willing to really negotiate or see any scenario where they could come to a truce. Even when the war ends, the Germans say, okay, let's have a truce. The Germans are, over the long term, they know they'll lose, especially now that the Americans get involved. But, they hadn't actually lost any territory yet. And it's not like World War II where they totally lose territory, right? The Russians invade Berlin, and But in World War I, we don't see that. The Germans sue for peace, and so there is a truce. But then in the aftermath, the Germans are punished for the conflict with the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, now the Spanish Civil War is important because basically it's a preview of World War II. We've got the fascist leaders in Germany, Hitler, and Italy, Mussolini, aiding the fascist Franco in Spain. And then we've got sort of this weaker alliance in which the Soviets are aiding the Republicans in Spain. And there's many French and British people, too, that are aiding them financially, donating money for the Republican cause against the fascists. Now, the French and British governments, amidst the Great Depression, amidst their anti-war sentiment after the destruction of World War I, don't get involved. The governments don't get involved. But many people do, or they feel an affinity for the Spanish Republicans. For example, George Orwell goes down and fights there in Spain. Now, the result is that it's a preview, right? We have this weird alliance between the communist Soviet Union and these Western democracies against fascism. So when Poland is invaded in 1939 by both the Soviet Union and the Germans, and the Germans invade first, right, 2 weeks earlier. So, they started it, right? But the Soviets move in and take over not just their half of Poland, but also Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Moldova and Romania as well. So they take over, sizable chunks of Europe. But there's already this sense that the fascists are the bigger threat. And that comes from, to some degree, the Spanish Civil War. It also comes from the fact that Hitler made all these agreements and said all these things and kind of kept breaking them. And also because ultimately he's got the bigger army at that point and the more threatening army. And we see that very quickly, right? In 1939, the war begins. But in 1940, Hitler opens up the Western Front. And so he moves through the Netherlands and Belgium into France and gets behind the Maginot Line. And so the French fall very quickly in 1940. And Hitler's unsuccessful in the Battle of Britain in 1940 at knocking out Britain and controlling the air. So then in 1941, Hitler looks east for the Lebensraum, or land, from Russia. So he invades Russia with Operation Barbarossa in 1941. And that, of course, is very consequential because Hitler, it looks like, will, does very well early on in that conflict, but once again gets bogged down by the Russian winter of 1941 to 42, and he's not able to capture Moscow. He's not able to capture Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, the old St. Petersburg. And his biggest defeat then is in 1942 at the Battle of Stalingrad, where the German army there, which is moving eastward in order to get oil from the northern Caspian Sea region, is defeated there at Stalingrad. And so after that, in 1942, the war is very, there's sort of a sense of confidence that Hitler is defeated as the Soviets move in. And in 1943, the Allies invade Italy through Sicily in the south. And in 1944, they open up what's called the Second Front with the D-Day invasion of Normandy. And that, once again, from Britain, the British, Australian, Canadian, and American troops invade France, the beaches of Normandy, and begin to push Germany back that way. And World War II ends with those Western countries, led by Britain and the United States, pushing back Germany from the West, in the West. The Soviet Union losing by far the most people, suffering incredible destruction. And for years facing Hitler and the German army alone, pushing back Germany from the East. And so the result is that in the aftermath of this war, we have a Europe divided. In the West, dominated by the United States. In the East, dominated by the Soviet Union. And this will be a Europe then that will be divided in its politics as a result of the different political systems and economic systems that those two countries espouse. The Americans will create liberal capitalist states in the West, including West Germany, which will be liberal and be a democracy. And then in the East, all those territories that the Russians conquered, those will be communist states. And so Europe will be, including Poland, and so Europe will be divided politically between those two different camps, militarily with the U.S. and the Soviet Union building up their nuclear stockpiles. Europe will be divided economically. The West will see economic consolidation with the creation of the European coal and steel community and the European common market, and eventually the European Union with the euro today. The East will be communist until 1989 and have command economies in which the government will control the production and will own all property. And so Europe will be divided politically, diplomatically, economically, certainly culturally as well. The West will be exposed to all sorts of American ideas and will undergo this great sort of popular culture, Americanization, some critics will point out. A feminist movement will spread in the West. The East will have a very different culture, much more closed as a result of the censorship and restrictions on culture from those more totalitarian communist states. And so that's the Cold War, and that's why I'm talking about that. It's a faux war. It's not an actual war. And luckily for us, we haven't seen another war. Europe, that most, which considers itself the most civilized continent, has the most destructive war in the history of mankind as a result of its industrial technology. And so we haven't seen another one since 1945.